Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Webb. I'm the Oral History Coordinator with the Washington County Historical Society. Today we are interviewing Ralph Lamoreaux, a longtime private abstractor, formerly with Dixie Title and Southern Utah Title Company, who has extensive knowledge of Washington County property records. Today's date is Tuesday, May 6th, 2025, and we are in the Community Education Channel studios on the campus of Utah Tech University. So let's begin the interview. What is your full name?
Ralph Carter Lamoreaux.
And where and when were you born?
They tell me I was born April 14th, 1931, but I didn't remember that.
Okay.
But incidentally, my birth certificate, as it was originally recorded, my name was Ralph Archie Lamoreaux. In other words, my grandfather's father was named Archie, and my mother's father was Ralph. And so in 2012, I had to get that Archie name out and the Carter put in. It was quite an extensive program to do that. But anyway, I've always been known as Ralph Carter Lamoreaux, and I was named after Ralph Thomas Carter, who was my grandfather.
Okay. So where and when were you born?
Born April the 14th, 1931.
Where?
In St. George, Utah.
Okay. And who else was in your family? Who else was in your family? Were there siblings, brothers and sisters?
Oh yeah. I had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. And I was the oldest.
Okay.
The next one in the family was Margene. She was born 2 years after I was. And then the next one was Orville Bruce Lamoreaux, and he was born in August of 1934, but he died in May of 1935 of a septic sore throat. And then he's buried in the St. George Cemetery, St. George City Cemetery on 600 East.
And what were your parents' names?
My father's name was Orville Archie Lamoreaux, originally from Paragouna, Utah, Iron County.
Okay. And your mother?
Mother, Beatrice Carter Lamoreaux. She was a twin sister to Bernice, Ralph Thomas, and Adrell Hunt Carter.
Okay. Did other family members live nearby? Did you have any relatives that lived nearby?
I had other siblings too that I should reiterate on those. After Bruce died, my only living brother then was Paul Lamore Lamoreaux, and he was born April 14th, 1935. And then later on in August, we had Beatrice Joy Lamoreaux. She was named after my mother. And then Carol Bernice Lamoreaux, who was named, the Bernice name was my mother, Beatrice's twin sister, Bernice, who married Ray Larson in Washington. And so that was the total. There were 6 of us in the family, with one deceased.
Okay, so what did your parents do for a living?
Their birth certificate said that my dad was a truck driver and my mother was a homemaker. That was the birth certificate. My dad was a chef, but also a truck driver part of the time. And of course, in Depression days, jobs were hard to come by, and times were tough for everybody, I'm sure.
Right.
And my mother worked waitress part-time at the cafes too when she was younger.
Okay. What did your community look like outside of your family? What was your neighborhood like?
The neighborhood was considerably quieter, obviously.
Yeah.
There were no hard surface streets. There were water ditches. Laterals coming off of, on the West City Spring, came off a diagonal street and down the various tiers of blocks. And so people would get up in the middle of the night sometimes and take the water and so forth. I know we had water on this place we have now, and the West City Spring, it was every 5 days and 7 hours, and if you missed the water, you were SOL, so to speak. So you had to get up in the middle of the night sometimes to take the water.
Right. Where did your ancestors come from?
Well, obviously there was the X on the end of Lamoreaux. It was a French name. So
Okay. I didn't know that, so that's really interesting to know, because I grew up with Kevin Lamoreaux. So
with Kevin?
Kevin Lamoreaux, yeah.
That's my oldest son.
Okay. So when did you come to the when did your ancestors come to the United States?
I think the French line were Huguenots, and they came to England and then came to the United States, and I can't tell you when now.
Okay.
I wasn't that interested in those old ones.
That's okay. Do you know where they settled?
Yeah,
First, when it came
for
to the United
instance,
States.
Andre Lamoreaux, that was one of my ancestors, owned part of Manhattan Island in years and years ago.
Okay.
And William Carter, of course, came from England.
Okay. Can you describe your grammar school and your high school years? What were those like?
Okay.
Where did you attend?
Okay, I was living at the time probably in Randall. My folks were renting from John T. Woodbury Sr., where he lived on the corner of 300 West Tabernacle. There's an office building now on that property. Anyway, they were renting there, and I went to Miss Conklin's Presbyterian Church School, which was like a preschool, and that was at on 200 North.
200 North and about, was it about 200 West?
It was in the middle of the block.
Okay.
And she had the bell on, and the bell was in the, it's gone now, and the bell was in the belfry up there, and she'd always ring the bell before, when it's time to go to school. And you had to, sometimes if you was late, why then she'd say, well, try to be on time next time. And
Right.
And then later on, we lived across, when I was 14 years old, we lived across the street in a home that originally was built by Minor Lobb, and it was right across the street from where Louisa Conklin lived in the house, east of the Presbyterian Church.
So did you go to like Woodward Junior High School?
Oh yes, went to,
Okay.
West
Did you go to West Elementary?
No, it was originally elementary.
Okay, just elementary.
It's where the school district office is now.
Okay. So you went to they just called it elementary school there.
That was the elementary school.
Okay.
And incidentally, my father-in-law, Howard Empey, helped, I imagine, the Christian brothers and so forth, lay the brick for that, and he would have to use the masonry, they called it Hod then, and so he had the nickname Hod Empey, because he went through this elementary school building completely and had a good job there at the time.
Okay. So then you went to Woodward Junior High?
Okay,
after
that first grade I was with the teacher, Miss Graff, and I think later on she married Bud Sorensen, but she was the first grade teacher. And then I moved to Paraguna, who was my father's hometown, and he worked at the iron mines. I lived there and went to school the second, third, and fourth grade. Then we returned to St. George, and we lived in Grandma and Grandpa Carter's old house while they just barely built their new one on the corner at 298 West, 300 North. And anyway, we lived there, and I went to school there with. Fifth grade was Misha Segmiller, sixth grade was Israel Nielsen, and then I went across the street into the seventh grade at Woodward High.
And you had various teachers there?
Various teachers.
Yes, okay. So then after that, you attended Dixie High School, right?
Well, it was all one high school.
Right, it was Dixie High School and the college were together at that time, right?
Well, in other words, we went to some classes over to the old Dixie College.
Okay, right.
Dixie Academy.
Dixie Academy, right. So it was kind of combined there. How far did you go in grades there? Did you graduate from high school?
I went to school till I was 17, and I dropped out of school, and of course we were having a tough time, and so I didn't ever go to any college per se. My next schooling was School of Hard Knocks, so to speak, and on into I was drafted in the Army, and
let me just back up just a little bit. Did you have any hobbies or interests as a child?
oh
Any fun things that you did while you were growing up?
yeah, I covered all of the Red Hill.
You like to hike and explore?
Like to hike, and from the Sugarloaf, you know where the Dixie Rock is.
Yes.
The Sugarloaf. From there west, clear to Watercress Springs, and we called it Watercress at that time. It was West City Springs,
Right.
and they called it Watercress.
And it was a beautiful place, right?
It was a beautiful place, and
kind of the predecessor of where Dixie Red Hills Golf Course located.
it is incorporated, and you can go there
Yeah.
to the clubhouse and still see the cave that they dug back in there to access some of the water.
Okay, so let me just get straight here. Before you went into the military, did you work at the Big Hand Cafe and the Liberty
I worked
Cafe?
at my first job.
Was this before the military?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
let me go. My first real job was when I was 11 years old, and that would have been in 1942, and I was a dishwasher at the Liberty Cafe,
Which was located
which was located in the center of the block
on 100 North.
on 100 North between Main and 100 East on the
Okay.
south side, next to the Liberty. It was part of the Liberty Hotel complex. And anyway, at 11 years old, that was my first job, and Clark Blake owned that, and my dad was a chef there. And so I got a job there
Doing what?
washing dishes.
Okay.
And I was so short then that they had to use wood pop crates for me to walk on to access and get the dishes where they could go in the dishwasher.
So what stood out to you about why people came to the Liberty Cafe? Was it the food? Was it the service? Was it both?
That was because the Burlington Trailways bus stopped there, and if they were going north, they'd come on the old Highway 91, and they'd take the lower street. We called it the lower street, and that went down on a curve through now Smith parking lot block, and came out Tabernacle Street. And when they got to the center of the block, they turned up an alleyway that went clear through the middle of the block. And then they'd pull up to the Liberty Cafe, which is on the right side in the alleyway, and open the door, and the people would go into the Liberty Cafe, and it was sometimes it was a rest stop, and sometimes they'd have meals there too. And at any rate, Burlington Trailways stopped. That was what it's for.
How long did you work there?
Well, my dad worked there, I think, sometime, and then later on, when we went to Paraguna, he worked in the iron mine, and then when he come back, he worked at Dick's Cafe, and I worked at Dick's Cafe for just a short time when Wally DeMille was the chef over there then. I remember one of the waitresses was Jewel Fry, which would be Shelby Fry's wife. Kent Fry's and Kyle, I think now, their mother, Jewel. She was a Googler. She worked there, and then for the next job that I had was at the Big Hand Cafe, and that was under the management of George Pace then. And I worked with various people there. The first one was Adrian Anderson. They called him Ad Anderson, and he married Fawn Giles. She grew up on the corner where the Dixie Market is now.
What did you do there?
I was a dishwasher there
Okay.
to start with.
What was George Pace like? What do you remember about him?
He was a nice guy, and his dad, and of course the family, owned the Rugged West Motel, which was on the north side, and
Just a little bit west of the cafe too, wasn't it?
well, that was Augustus Hardy, the Hardy House. And
Okay.
of course, the little jail is back in there now.
Right.
And now part of the Ancestor Square complex.
So
And-
didn't they have like a Trailways bus that came, or was it a Greyhound bus that came?
Well, the Greyhound came to the Big Hand Cafe.
Okay.
The Trailways was a red bus, and the Greyhound was more of a blue color.
Okay. So Greyhound stopped at Big Hand. Did the Trailways stop any cafe in St. George?
I think at first they were Dick's, and then I think they stopped at Liberty Cafe, and of course,
Okay.
and when they'd come in from the same with when Trailways would come from south, they'd take the lower road from out there about Wendy's, and they had another road going down there to tie into Tabernacle, and that's the way they'd come.
Okay.
And when the Greyhound bus had come, of course the Greyhound was on the corner of Boulevard and we'll call it 100 North and Main Street. But if they were going south, they'd turn at the Pioneer Courthouse corner and go up the street. Sometimes they'd do the left in the center of the block at the Macquarie Museum there, go past the jail and the fire station and come out on Main Street and do a left and park right down next to the door back from the stop sign, and everybody get out and go in the restaurant.
Okay.
If they were coming from the west, they'd come down the boulevard and turn on 100 West and go to 200 North and do the right, and that was Brigham Young home. And around the corner diagonal and then down the street, and if there were a number of buses, a lot of times they'd park in front of the Grundy House, which back then Sherman Hardy lived there, and it was all down to that point, down to Matty Impey's, it was all rock ditches then. And then when you got down to Big Hand, it was all curb and gutter. They put that in and had the wider sidewalk.
Okay. So at age 17, you left to go in the military. Is that correct?
No, when I went in the military, I was 19.
You were 19.
Okay, and
Which branch of service did you go in?
well, no, I was 20 when I went in. This is the program there. I lived at 240 West, 200 North. That was where across from the Conklin Presbyterian Church. Moved there when I was 14, and anyway. I'd been ordained in the LDS Church. Is it all right to bring that in?
Sure.
Yeah, I've been ordained in the LDS Church as an elder under Mabin B. Ashby, who was the bishop then, and I was ready to go on a mission, an LDS mission. And the draft board, they had a draft board, and the inductees, those that were drafted, were classed 1A and 1B and so forth. Anyway, I was 1A, and I was ready to go, and I had actually met with the stake presidency, and I think the stake president then was James Andrus.
This is St. George Stake.
St. George Stake, original
Okay.
St. George Stake. And I was ready to go and was getting the papers signed, and then the draft board decided that I need to join the Army, and so Leroy H. Cox, he was in the Second World War. No, he was in the First World War, and he was over the draft board, and incidentally a relative of my grandmother's. And anyway, I was drafted, and so on April the 23rd, 1951, I and Delmont Truman boarded the Greyhound bus, headed for Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City to be drafted into the Army. And we stopped, it was on old Highway 91, and I think we stopped only, sometimes they'd go through Harrican and sometimes just over Leeds, up through that way. Anyway, in that case, they went to Harrican. We picked up somebody named Hinton, and then went up the Black Ridge, and of course we didn't go over to New Harmony. It was off the beaten path, but we went through Canaraville and on up into Hamilton Ford on the old highway and right into Cedar City, and all of the way up Highway 91, we'd stop at about every town and pick up other inductees being drafted.
So it probably took you 8 to 10 hours to get there,
yes,
right?
And not only that, but the speed limit was, I think, 55 back then.
Yeah, I believe that. So was this during World War II?
No, this was just.
What year?
Yeah, it would have been after World War II.
Okay, so what year did you join?
Well, 1951.
1951. Okay.
October the 23rd is the day I left.
Okay, so this is during the Korean War then?
Yes, during the Korean.
Okay. And how long did you serve, and what experiences did you have serving in the military? Where did you go from, did you say Camp Douglas or Fort Douglas?
Fort Douglas, and went from there, and then we got on the train and went to Fort Lewis. And
Fort Lewis, Washington?
And that was unusual for me because every day it had rained up there the time we was drafted, compared to St. George, and it rained twice a year down here, you know.
Right. Well, what did you do? What did you do in the military there at Fort Lewis?
Then from there I got on the train and we went down to Camp Roberts, down near Paso Robles, California.
Okay.
And I had this 6-week basic training where learned to march and fire weapons and so forth, and then we moved across the river to cook school, or some of us did, and because I had cooked at Big Hand Cafe when I was 17, 18, 19 years old. I'd cooked there and worked there. That's what they well, I went to cook school anyway, and learned how to cook Army way in the field ranges back then, the M1937 field range, which was a gas-powered freestanding stove to cook on. And
did you go to Korea?
Yes.
Okay.
And we left, and I remember we went under the Golden Gate Bridge at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we got on the troop ship, and I think there was 3,300 of us on there on the troop ship. And we stopped at Hawaii, and I got with a GI that he was a military, his father was in the military, and he knew his way around Hawaii, and they turned us loose for 8 hours while they refueled and took on freight and dropped freight. His name was Landau. And so we went along Waikiki Beach and seen some of the program that was going on there. And we stopped later on at Guam and took on supplies there. And then we came into Tokyo Bay on the tide, and it was early in the morning. It was a beautiful sight, seeing Mount Fuji in the background, and come in there. And we spent a couple of weeks there and got some more shots, and then we got on a ship and made a short journey around out of Japan and into Busan, South Korea. And that's where we landed, and that was a culture shock to me because some of the ladies would have their baskets on their head, and they'd be carrying their produce, and they were nothing above their breasts would be showing. That was quite a that was a culture shock.
Oh, I bet. So when you got there, were you there when Pusan, I think Pusan was attacked by North Korea, is that right?
Well, Pusan was kind of at the extreme south end.
Yeah. So what did you do there? Were you cooking for the
soldiers? I was cooking there, yeah.
Okay.
I was in a replacement company, 40th Infantry Division, 40th Replacement Company, and the closest I was to the front lines is about 12 miles away.
Did you hear the?
We could hear the artillery going, sometimes at night too, and this replacement company, we had 200 permanent party at the base we were at, and 200 soldiers there, and they'd come in on the train, and they might bring 2,000 in. And they might, if they came in the middle of the night, we had to get up and fix coffee and coffee cake or something for them to eat as they came in. And then we had the various tents, and they'd get out and sleep for a day or two, and then they'd go to the front lines. And then they'd bring back some from the front lines, and we might have 200 or 300 more as they brought them back. And so it was always a variable
number of people that you were serving food to.
And there was we had 5 cooks, and we had one ration man. He was originally from Brooklyn, New York, and named Trigonoli. That sounds like an Italian name, or doesn't it? Anyway.
And how long were you there? How long were you
I was there 16 months.
16 months, wow.
And when I came home, we left Incheon Harbor, which was up. I was there at the time, the 38th parallel. The truce was called in August of 1953. And so they quit fighting, and I got on a truck and went to Incheon, and then got on a ship and came all the way up, and we went up by the Aleutian Islands, and it was cold up there, and down the Gulf of Alaska and on down the west coast, and I came into San Francisco Bay under the Golden Gate, and here was this beautiful lady out there singing "God Bless America."
Wow.
And even today, it makes me...
Yeah, it's so touching. So when you got back to St. George, what occupation or career did you pursue? And why did you choose that career?
Well, when I got back to St. George, I could have gone back to work. The law required that if you had worked in some business, you had the option to go right back to the business, and the business had to hire you. That was the rule of thumb at that time. I could have gone back to work at the Big Hand Cafe. I was off a short time, and then Howard Carter was my uncle, my mother's brother, only brother, and he had started Carter Abstract Company.
Okay.
And before that, he had worked for Hafen and Nelson as an abstract and attorney firm, and that's where he got his initial start. And so Carter Abstract.
So they offered you a job.
Howard Carter offered me a job, and I didn't know beans about typing anything, but I had to learn to type. But it was a GI Bill. They called it a GI Bill that was provided for veterans on-the-job training. And at the time it was that I went to work with Howard, I had $155 a month was on-the-job monthly wage.
Okay, so was this Carter Abstract Service, or was this Southern Utah Title?
No, it was Carter Abstract.
Carter
initially.
Abstracts Company or Service?
Yeah, Carter Abstract Company,
And where was it located?
53 East, 100 North.
Okay, and what were
Next to Pickett Lumber.
Okay. Oh, and what were your duties there?
Well, we were close to the Pioneer Courthouse, and if you made an abstract is a history in total, so to speak, of all of the documents in Washington County, some of it in a summarized form, and it gave a history, a chain of title, if you will. And this given piece of property from the sovereign. In other words, St. George was incorporated August 17th, 1862. That was the corporate charter at that time. But the patent wasn't issued for the city entry until 1872.
Oh my gosh, that's a long time afterwards.
And so the patent for the city entry was issued to Joseph W. Young, who was the mayor at that time, as the trustee for the inhabitants of St. George City, Washington County, Utah Territory, for their benefit. And by law, the mayor and the probate court determined who had what, and various people had already camped out here, so to speak. The earliest documents were called land certificates, and they were issued the first of them in the record was 1859. And if we went to the record, we could find those if we needed to. But they were issued, and the mayor's deed were issued, and a city lot, usually one city lot was designated to so-and-so, and that lot was 8/10 of an acre. It was 132 by 264 feet in size. And of course the streets, the blocks were laid out in the grid pattern. Some of if we lived in the one block, the lots ran north and south, lots 1 through 8. And then the next block on either side would have been horizontal grid pattern. And the idea was that you lived in the front border of the lot, and you had your corrals and so forth in the back, and your garden area and so forth. Anyway, the mayor's deed were issued, and most of the lots sold for $5.
Let me stop you there for just a second. You described, the lots and the blocks and everything. Isn't that kind of based on Joseph Smith's Plat of Zion, going clear back to Nauvoo?
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Okay.
It was a common thing. Everything was mostly laid out in a grid pattern, and they were a systematic type thing. And of course, we had various plats and so forth. And then my personal opinion is that when the pioneers first came here and started to establish the town, I think it's just a personal opinion, and I can't verify it in any respect, but I think Erastus Snow was the prophet or the LDS go-to guy. And
Here in St. George, right.
And then I think he and Brigham Young told everybody, okay, go out and get your homestead taken care of, because we don't want all these Gentiles to come in and take over part of it.
Right. Okay. So, as I understand it, you were working for Carter Abstract Service, but you were also working at the Washington County Recorder's Office, right?
Well, the abstract, okay.
And that's where the property records were kept, correct?
The property records were over there. And
that was that in the Pioneer Courthouse?
In the Pioneer Courthouse.
97 East St. George Boulevard? Okay.
97 East, 100 North.
Okay.
And at any rate, every morning at 8 o'clock, I'd go to work at Carter Abstract, and later on, incidentally, Howard and I formed Southern Utah Title, Incorporated.
What year?
I can't tell you that offhand now.
Okay.
But at any rate,
have you look that up for me, or your daughter Lisa. Let me know when Southern Utah Title was organized.
I'd have to really think that out and maybe.
It's okay. We can come back to that later.
Okay. Now I would leave there and I'd walk over to the courthouse with a little briefcase like I have here, maybe, and there was no room at the courthouse for anybody to sit, to work. The county clerk's office was in the northeast corner, and then we had the county commissioner room adjoining that with another door and another door going out under the hall. And then on down toward the south side, it was the assessor's office in the southeast corner. And then in the southwest corner, there were steps and the restroom under the steps, and it went up to the courtroom upstairs, as you know. And then the next one north, going up the west side, was the recorder's office. And then the county treasurer's office was in the northwest corner. But then later on, they had a little vault that went out to the north, built on into the treasurer's office. But at any rate, I'd go at the courthouse, and we had a Smith Corona typewriter, and we had a long table, which was about 3 feet wide, and it was in the hall on the east side.
I was going to ask you. I bet it was out in the hallway.
Yes.
So, because there's just not a lot of room there.
There wasn't a lot of room.
Oh my gosh! So you worked in that hallway with that table, right? Typing
with that table
and that Smith Corona.
Yeah, and then Hafen and Nelson's abstractor, Harvey Smoots, worked on the other end, and yes, you had to go and get the various books. You had to go through the treasurer's office to go back to the vault to get some of the books, and some of them were in the recorder's office proper. And then you had to take those out in the hall and open them up and do your typing to make the abstract.
Right. So you got to see a lot of signatures, right? Hand signatures. And you became really good at being able to identify signatures, right?
Well, you see, when you there's a difference. Nowadays, we use title insurance. We don't worry much about that. But when you make an abstract, you have to take each document individually, type it, and get it as accurate as possible. It has to be proofread in your head at least. And so you saw various signatures on documents as you went through. And this is a common thing for the title people. That Ron Nelson had Nelson Supply, which was, anyway, originally it was his dad's Western Auto. They had their business there in the Liberty Hotel complex on the south side of Boulevard. Anyway, Ron Nelson had this little contest that he published, and he says if you can figure out who these signatures are, you can get 2 nights free at so-and-so place in Las Vegas. And I looked at it, and he said, well, I've seen those signatures, so I looked them up, and there was 5 signatures there, and if you looked at those signatures, you couldn't possibly make anybody's name out of it.
Yeah.
Because a bunch of scribbling, so
Right.
to speak. And those 5 names were John William Hickman, who was one of the founders of Dixie State Bank. He was a banker, originally from Beaver. And John W. Palmer, he was an attorney. Lang Formaster was an attorney. And Jack Holt, he had the Twin Oaks Motel out there, among other things. And let's see, the last one was Irvin Wesley Millen, who was Millen Jewelry. So that's the 5 names, and I went to school with Wes Millen, incidentally. So I meandered up to Ron Nelson's business, and I said, I want to solve this puzzle you got here. And I told him who they were, and he, "You son of a gun, I knew you'd do something like this." And I went to school with Ron. It was a joke, so to speak.
So you won, and did you get to get
No, I didn't ever take advantage of it.
Oh, I was hoping that you would take advantage and that you would be able to win and go down to Las Vegas.
Well, I had the chance, and I told various people. Larry Blake was one of them, who was with Southern Utah Title, and Ed Bowler too. I told them that's their signatures.
Okay, so how did you become familiar with who owned the property in Washington County, and how were you as an abstractor able to assist such agencies as the Washington County Attorney's Office?
Well, it wasn't so much the attorney's office. It was mainly the recorder. I was in adjoining the recorder's office. Incidentally, a couple of times while I was working in the old Pioneer Courthouse, Helen Barker was the county recorder, and Wilma Andrus was the deputy. And they decided a couple of times to go to Salt Lake to the various county conventions, and so I was the temporary recorder for a day or two, a couple of times.
Oh, that's really neat.
And another thing that's is interesting here, as we go through and do these documents and make these abstracts, initially they were written in longhand. And you've seen some of them probably in your historical business there. Written in longhand, and there was, I can't tell you just when they quit them, but then it was, they had long carriage typewriters, and so Will Andrus would type most of the documents, and all of those documents had to be proofread that were typed. And finally in the 60s we went to a roll of film, a microfiche program, where they would photograph them and send that north, and this outfit up there would print the pages and bring them back, and then we put them in the various books.
Okay. So during the time that you worked as an abstractor, land transfers and lending changes went from occasionally, just doing it once or twice a day, up to 200 to 300 documents a day. So what do you believe brought about such a rapid change, and how did that impact your job? And I guess the job of other abstractors?
Well, it was actually the job of others. I was out of the business. I quit that in 1979, and it got too busy to suit me.
So this was actually in 1979. This was probably prior to, oh gosh, in the early 80s, it seemed like is when we really saw the main push into population increase in Washington County.
Well, see,
still,
the freeway was built over here. Incidentally, I have a couple of pictures of when they made the cut through the East Black Ridge, which I could produce. And
what was that like when you saw that?
I was informed at that time that they were going to open that up, and so I went over about where Red Hills Parkway comes off the hill there to the old movie theater off on Industrial Road there, and they had already done the preliminary work on the top of the cut. And the cats had been up there and had pushed off all of the ledges of black rock on top, and then they had their chargers in to start the project of exploding and pulverizing the red sandstone, which is under the
lava rock.
Under the lava rock. So I got a couple of pictures of that explosion. And
how long did that take for that construction to clear that?
I don't remember, but the first. Before the freeway was built through the gorge, they used that cut before that. It was an extension of St. George Boulevard on a big turn over part of the freeway now, and then through the cut. And the Utah Highway Patrol checking station was over on the Middleton side on the south side.
I remember that.
And the first one was over where Dean Terry's home is, in next to the Snow Canyon Summit thing on where Dean Terry's house is. The first checking station was there.
Over on Sunset Boulevard.
On
Okay. Okay.
And then anyway, the checking station was there. And then in 1970, they completed the gorge work, and the freeway was built.
In 1973.
Yeah, 1973, before it was done. It started before that sometime.
Wow. So how did legal descriptions, which originally referenced landmarks, how did that change over time?
Well, when I think of that, I have two grandsons that work at Southern Utah Title, and my son helped me a little bit in the early, when I had left Carter Abstract and went on my own. My son helped me, so we actually had three generations that was associated in the abstract business. But Dallas Lamoreaux and Bryce Lamoreaux now work at Southern Utah Title.
Okay.
But at any rate, things had changed completely by the time that freeway was built. It was extremely busier at that time in the 1973 era. When I was first with Carter Abstract, sometimes we had, referencing back to that time, Carter Abstract, when they first started, it was tough. You might have one abstract in 2 weeks to make.
Right. But apparently the, I don't know, a description, let's see, I'm trying to remember, let's see, that there was a tie to an old peach tree.
Okay.
Can you tell me about that?
I kidded Bryce, my grandson. I said, there's a deed over there, and it's in block, I think it's lot 2, block 36, Washington Town Resurvey. And it says, it's in book H, and I can't tell you the page now, but it said, beginning at a lone peach tree, 4 to 6 inches through. And this would have been in the 1880s, I think.
Okay.
And running thence north 132 feet to a cedar stake. Thence east, so many feet to a cedar stake. Thence south to the south line, and then thence west to the point of beginning.
Okay.
Okay, there's no way you could follow that now.
Yeah.
Because that peach tree had been dead a long time.
Right. Okay, so what difficulties did St. George residents go through obtaining home loans when you began working?
About the only one that done much loaning was the Bank of St. George.
So, and then there was apparently Andy MacArthur and Merv and John Reber were also making loans as well.
Well, yeah, and there was other people that made loans too.
So what was that like? I understand that Andy MacArthur had kind of an interesting way of making loans along with Merv Reber, as opposed to how the Bank of St. George made loans. Do you recall the differences?
Well, the differences was when Andrew MacArthur would make a loan, he would expect it to be paid. And there were various people.
Like paid when?
As soon as possible, but it didn't always work out that way.
Okay.
But the Bank of St. George was originally on the corner of Tabernacle and Main. That was the building. There was a Dixie Stockgrower Bank next to the Arrowhead Hotel. And when I first started, Claire Terry worked there. He was one of the big shots, so to speak, and W.W. MacArthur was one of them. And
who was W.W. MacArthur?
Wilfred Woodruff MacArthur.
Oh, okay.
Rutger MacArthur's father, and he lived on Diagonal Street, West Main Street.
Okay, so where was Andy MacArthur's office?
Andrew MacArthur's, he didn't have an office.
Did he work out of his home?
He worked out of the bakery.
Oh, he worked out of a quality bakery? He was making loans
bakery. And I remember I bought, before I married Janice, I got a loan and bought a 1950 Ford, and I borrowed the money from Andrew MacArthur. And I remember as I made the payments, I would go into the front of the Quality Bakery and say whoever was running the front, I said, I need to speak to Andy. And Andy'd come out and he'd be wiping the dough off in his hands, and he had the hair all shaved off down here, and it was all shaved off and clean. And so I'd sit down and pull out a receipt book, and he'd say, now let's see, it's $108 and so much, and okay. And he'd write me a receipt, and I'd give him the cash and go on my way.
My gosh.
And that was Andrew's way of doing business.
Okay.
But Bank St. George, Clara Terry would bring me the loan document to the abstract company, and he'd bring it up and he'd say, Ralph, my boy, you get this recorded, and then when we're in first place, and then finish up the abstract. And so that was done, and St. George Savings and Loan was also making a few loans, and that was under later on Dick Mathis. And anyway, it was next to Tri-State there, and Arrowhead Department Store.
And Merv and John Reber were making loans from near the Dixie Bowl, right?
They were making. They had an office next to the Dixie Theater.
Okay. Oh, the Dixie Theater. Okay.
Originally, that was the Wadsworth Theater.
Right.
When I was young, and
Okay.
And when I went to the movie when I was a kid, and they go to the matinee, it was only 11 cents to buy a ticket to the matinee.
Oh my gosh, I know, must have been really cheap. So what title companies operated during the time that you worked as an abstractor, and how did they get along?
Hafen and Nelson had Harvey Smoots, and she and I got along okay. Prior to that, there was various other abstractors. One of them was Ellen Carter, and she made abstracts under the authority of the county recorder. In other words, the county recorder could make an abstract, and they'd say, okay, this is the property, and here's the patent, and then here's all the documents and so forth. Later on, John T. Woodbury Sr. was an abstractor too.
So were there two main companies, the Dixie Title Company and the Southern Utah Title
Well, that was
Company?
later on.
That was later on. Okay.
Originally,
so these were just individuals.
Huh?
Were these just individuals that were operating as abstractors?
Yeah, they were individuals, and Leroy H. Cox was an abstractor too. And Hafen and Nelson, that was Percy Nelson, who was an attorney, and Orville Hafen was an attorney. And Howard Carter got his experience through Hafen and Nelson.
Okay. And they all got along pretty well?
And they got along pretty well, yeah.
Okay.
And anyway, getting back to Carter Abstract, when I first went to work, it was some days there wasn't anything happening. And finally I got a job and worked some couple of days a week across the street at the Liberty Cafe in the afternoon, because there wasn't enough business to keep things going.
Okay.
And Carter Abstract also, in 1956, contracted with the State Tax Commission to sell license plates. And so that happened in 1956, and if you were going to license your car, you had to go to the assessor's office in the old courthouse and get a clearance. And back then you could actually have your car taxes attached to your real estate, and you didn't have to pay the tax on your car until they were due on the 30th of November in that year. And they'd bring the slip back back over to Carter Abstract, and we'd fill out the registration and stamp it and so forth. And then Howard also had Western Union contract, and we'd send money here, there, and everywhere. And Rocky Mountain was a big Western Union user.
You're talking about Rocky Mountain Produce Company?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. What Washington County recorders did you work with during your work tenure?
The majority of them was Helen Pierce Barker. And she had 3 boys. I went to school with Dwayne, her oldest. and she had 2 boys, Bruce and Nelson. And her husband had died, I don't know for what reason. I think his name was Merle and I Blake, but I'm not positive on that. And she was Nelson Pierce's daughter. And she when I first went there, she'd walk to work from clear up on 400 North and come down diagonal. And sometimes she'd get a ride, and Wilma Andrus lived across from the library there on 100 South, and she'd always walk to work. And as I said before, she would have this long carriage typewriter, wasn't electric, and she'd type the document as it came in, and then Helen and Wilma would proofread it and make sure it was right, and then it was officially recorded.
Okay, so there was just one county recorder that you worked with?
No, there was others.
Who?
Okay, and then Helen retired, for she married Billy Barker, and finally she retired. And
who replaced her? Who did you work with after that?
Well, we had Lane Tate, and he was there a short time, and Herbert Snow Bentley was there a short time, and finally Gail Thomas Andrus was there.
Okay. Were there any differences in their management styles?
Well,
anything that stood out between Helen and these others?
Well, there were various deputies too. You had Beth Tolton, that was under Helen. She would, and then finally under Gail Thomas or Gail Andrus, Burl Heaton came there, and they'd do the initial indexing and make sure the document was in the proper place. And they were kind of inexperienced, so to speak, and if somebody'd come in, and I had some experience with, as you know, with abstracting and so forth, and somebody'd come in and say, I want to look at a map of my property. A lot of times they'd say, well, they'd come back and say, Ralph, do you know where so-and-so lot is, and so forth, and I'd tell them, well, yeah, I think if you look in range 13, you can find it. And I had it like right here, because I had had extensive experience in various properties. And when I made an abstract, I got to where as the names came up, I knew the names, even though I might not know the person. And later on, I might know the person and remember the names.
Okay. From abstracting, title companies began issuing title insurance. What advantages did that give potential home buyers or those wanting to purchase commercial property?
Okay, if I made an abstract, this is the way it would work. We'll say that Ed Snow wants to give Jack Holt a deed to this property. And so Ed Snow comes in and orders an abstract. And so we make the abstract, and then Ed Snow would say, I want you to make a deed to Jack Holt, will you? And so he'd take the abstract and the deed, and I'd always, when I'd do it, I'd always hand the deed after I'd made it, and the Snows had signed it. I'd hand it to the Snow, and they had to give it to Jack Holt. That was called deliverance.
Okay.
And that was an early day thing.
Okay.
Nowadays, and we had attorneys, we could make a deed, being an abstractor and having description and so forth, we could make a deed for $2. The attorneys were charging $10 minimum. We had a couple of attorneys that wanted to sue the title people and make sure that the attorneys could prepare the deeds. But now...
And now how does it work?
Now it works that the title company does all of the deeds, all of the documentation, and it's all handled through the title company in trust for the seller and the buyer.
Okay. So what other What other events in St. George that you witnessed personally as an abstractor stand out for you?
Now say that again.
Were there any other particular events in St. George that you witnessed personally as an abstractor that stand out for you? In other words, were there, what residential or commercial changes occurred maybe in the St. George Historic District?
Okay,
during the years
let's
that
consider that a little bit. We know where Zion Bank is now. On that corner, Main Street and Boulevard, there was a Standard Cafe run by George Anderson, and then we were going to go east. The next one was Clarence Force had a rock shop there. And at first, when I was young, there was supposed to have been a show house there, but I don't ever recall that. And then the next place was going east was OK Market, and that was run by Harold and Elma Snow Miles, Richard Miles' father. OK Market. And the next one over was Francis and Joe Simmons, and it was a beer parlor. They had one son.
Remember what it was called?
It was called the California Inn.
Okay.
And then they had one son, Crane, and they lived in the back of the California Inn. And incidentally, Crane became a NASA engineer of rockets and so forth in Florida. I'm not even sure he's still alive. And then the next business was Renoff and Thompson. That was a garage run by Roy Renoff, who later became the sheriff of Washington County. And then a lot of people don't remember this, but there was a little business in the northeast corner of the Renoff and Thompson building called St. George Finance. And it was a little one-room place next to the alleyway. It was called St. George Finance, and that was run by J.R. Naldist.
Okay.
And then the alleyway was approximately 18 feet wide, and you couldn't get two cars up and down it. In other words, once the bus came in there was no way to drive a car through. And then it was the Liberty Cafe, Liberty Hotel complex. The first one was the Liberty Cafe, and then the Liberty Hotel. And then in my day, it was Az MacArthur, the barber. And then it was West Nelson. It was Western Auto, and then it became Nelson Supply. And then it was Dixie Auto Parts. And then I vaguely recall May Pace lived where that Texaco station was. And Walter Pace was her son, and he was the recorder at the St. George Temple for a number of years. And Dan Smoots bought the Pace place and built the Texaco station.
On the corner?
On the corner.
And in between there, wasn't there down in the basement the Liberty Lounge?
Yeah, there was the Liberty Pool Hall.
That's right.
And
Okay.
you went on the east side of Dixie Auto Parts, who was run by Tony Reynolds, and Kay Heaton worked there. Kay just died a year or two ago. He worked there for a long time too, as well as Skylar Maggard, who lived out by the college, by Dixie Tech now. Worked with Tony and Dixie Auto Parts. But anyway, you went down an alleyway on the east side of the building. There was a stairway there, and it went down to a pool hall down in there, under the Nelson Supply and Dixie Auto Parts.
Right. Okay. So, and you retired in 1979
From the title business.
from the title business. Okay. So, describe how you met your wife.
She and her cousin we'd seen them before. I went with Lauren Prisby, who lived in the northwest part of Sandtown, where Sandstone Park is now. We'd seen these two girls walking the street a little bit, and they weren't repute type girls. They were just school girls. When I say walking the street. Anyway, they were on the corner of Josephine Prisby's mother and father's place, where the conical station was, and his name was Lee Ampey, and she was Dora Burgess Ampey. But anyway, Josephine got together. We picked them up in Lauren's car, and I got in the rumble seat with Janice in the back, and that's how it all started.
So Janice's maiden name is?
Ampey.
Ampey, Janice Ampey.
And also Josephine Ampey was her cousin.
Okay. So can you describe or list your children, your grandchildren, and great-grandchildren if you have any?
Well, we haven't got 4 hours to list 52 great-grandchildren, so.
Okay. How many children?
We have 6 children.
6 children, and how many grandchildren did you say?
27.
27, and great-grandchildren was?
Counting now, I think 52 or 3.
52 or 3, okay. So what other civic or community or religious organizations have you participated in, if any?
I didn't like to function, so to speak, in much as far as organizations. I didn't care that much for it. I was a member of the Kiwanis Club for a couple of years. I got in a couple of Easter egg hunts with the Kiwanis Club, and I helped them on the 4th of July explode from the Sun Bowl on the northwest corner of the the northwest corner of the Sun Bowl with all of their fireworks. And I remember I had a nice T-shirt, and the first time I done it, the sparks would fly, those cannons going off, and those shots going in the air, and all the sparks would come down, burned a lot of holes in that brand new shirt.
Oh gosh. So were there any other hobbies then? If you weren't involved with organizations, were there hobbies or things that you did when you weren't working that you enjoyed?
I love to hunt and fish.
Okay. What kind of hunting?
Any kind, mostly deer hunting, usually a family type thing, and my boys, and then the Lamoreaux boys, and some of us, and friends, and so forth.
Okay. So as you look back over your life, what would you like to be remembered for?
I can't think of anything.
Nothing? Nothing?
Well, I'd like to hope that people understand that title work years ago isn't the same as it is now. And it was a slower pace back when I was doing abstract work. Nowadays it's a hurry type thing, and like we said before, documents go to the recorder's office up to 200-300 a day now. And when I first started, they might have 2, maybe 3 recorded documents a week.
And it sounds like you had some really good memories of going back to that time when you were working and when the town was smaller and people were closer. Does that?
People were closer. You didn't know everybody, but you knew who they were when you saw them, usually. And I knew a lot of the old timers that, of course, gone. And when I think of older people, I think of Charles Foster Jr., who lived on the corner of Boulevard and 100 West. And he married Jenny Nixon Foster. And we had Elizabeth MacArthur Gardner lived up the street from him on 100 West. And I think of some of those older people. The oldest house one time was the Burgess house on 200 West, just off of Boulevard. And I didn't know anybody that lived there other than Bill Snow lived there in a newer house that he tore down the old one with. Some of the things that really stood out to me was how much things had changed since I was young. And see, when you consider Main Street now and then, we'll say Main Street on the east side from Boulevard. The first one was Standard Station, and then there was a pawn shop there, and later on Clyde Christensen built a little place there, and he was a shoe repair man. And then you had Roy Cox, was the Cox building with Ray Squires in the southwest side. That was his son-in-law. But prior to that, there was a Conoco station pump and a sign next to Snow Dress Shop. And I understood that that was the starting of Mellon Truck Line, was right there.
So you got to know these people as well as see the abstract documents of people that own these businesses. And
I got to see a lot of them, yes.
And that's what made it special, right?
Right.
Okay. So is there anything else that you feel is important that I haven't asked you that you'd like to tell us about before we close?
I'm sure I would think of something, but I think that's the end.
Okay. Well, we want to thank Ralph Lamoreaux for taking the time to be with us today. We also want to thank Lauren Golden and the staff of the Community Education Channel Studios for allowing us to use their studios and for their technical expertise. This is the Washington County Historical Society's 20th interview since I began conducting oral history interviews here in 2021. Thank you again for joining us.